press, India has become incrementally is becoming more and more important because there are a lot of value getting generated, such as this from here. And over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen some of these books and research-based effort which we have done from here is really impacting other parts of the world as well. And it is a huge honor for us to do that. And I think one of that such events are happening today. So it's an honor to have for us to launch TVs and Hers and Anantha's book here today. When we were preparing for this event, I was reminded of my own journey. 2008 May, I was a banker. I was working with Citibank, and I was at the helm of what was happening in the banking and the financial sector. And when I was told that you have to be here in this event, I was absolutely reminded what happened during the time of September. And then when I started calculating the years, the 10 years of that has really gone, and it was absolute coincidence that we are having the launch of this book also at the right time for a topic which is so important, and I'm sure the panelists here would really be able to give us more and more knowledge about what does it mean from today's perspective. So I think with that, I would actually hand it over to TV for taking this forward, and we're all part of this one session for any kind of interaction. As much as interactive we can make it, will be good for us. Thank you.
A very good afternoon to all of you who've chosen to come at 3 p.m. on a working day. I'm sure you all have more important things to do than this at 3 p.m., but you've still chosen to come, so thank you very much. And you've also come to discuss what is a rather abstruse book, or 2 abstruse books, which don't concern any of you in your normal daily lives. And those of you that have turned up, I presume are here more because of the eminence of our 2 panelists than because of the content of these 2 books. But thank you all the same. There are 2 books we are discussing today. One rather simple way of distinguishing between these 2 books is that one is a book on the what and the how of derivatives. It's like, what are derivatives? How are they traded? How are they priced? How can you make money on derivatives? And of course, how can you lose money on derivatives? They're both equally likely, actually. The other book is a book about the why and perhaps the why not of derivatives. Why do we need them? Do they serve a useful economic purpose? And if so, how should they be regulated? So this, in essence, is the second book. Another way of looking at the 2 books is that one is primarily a practical book for people who want to deal with the derivatives markets. The other is primarily philosophical and conceptual, albeit with some practical implications for policy. Yet another distinction between the 2 books is that one is primarily for users of the markets, investors, investment advisors, bankers, accountants, students of finance. The other is mainly aimed at economists, policymakers, and of course, students of economics and public policy. So I'll start with the book called Derivatives, which is what I call the How book. The first edition of this book was actually published in 1998, which is this. I was then the sole author of the book, and at the time I was in the World Bank. And for me, it was really just a matter of academic or professional pride to get the book published. I didn't expect it to sell at all. In fact, I used to joke at the time that it was a kind of book that was actually read only by the author from cover to cover. Nobody else had actually read it from the first page to the last. But to my surprise, whether people read it or not, it actually went into 9 reprints. And that was what really gave us the stimulus to attempt a second edition. So what we're discussing today is the second edition of that book, which is this. And this is not merely an updated version of the first book, but thanks to the 2 co-authors who are at the 2 extremes of this table, the book has been considerably enriched because they brought their very rich perspectives into it. This book introduces the main derivative instruments: futures, forwards, swaps, options, swaptions, other kinds of derivatives, structured products, and though they're not strictly derivatives, exchange traded funds. To read and understand this book, and this was the objective that we had set for ourselves, to read and understand this book, you don't need a prior knowledge of either derivatives or finance or economics. And after reading this, you should still have a nodding acquaintance with the subject without this prior knowledge. That was really the objective. And you certainly don't need any more mathematics than high school level in order to understand this book. From a user perspective, the book attempts to be comprehensive because it doesn't just deal with the hows and whys of hows and whats of derivatives trading. It also covers accounting for derivatives. So if you're a user of derivatives, how do you account for them in your books? It deals with the taxation policies on derivatives. Of course, these become out of date very quickly, but the principles usually don't change very much. There's also a detailed appendix in this book on the global financial crisis and what role derivatives played in that crisis, which, as Mr. Jha pointed out, broke out, if there's a single date, it broke out on September the 7th, 2008, which is almost exactly 10 years ago, which is when Lehman Brothers collapsed. The second book that we're discussing today is what I call the Why book, which is this. It's called Economics of Derivatives. It looks at the definition of derivatives, an economic typology of what kinds of derivatives. It discusses the economic functions of derivatives markets. So why do they, is there any economic function behind these markets? Are they, as some people would argue, as useful as insurance markets? Or are they, as some others would argue, as useless as casinos? So this is an important policy question for regulators, for ministries of finance, for academics, and this book gets into that issue in considerable detail. It discusses the issue of market completion, which is the notion that the more complete the structure of markets in an economy, the closer you are to an optimal level of welfare. The book also devotes considerable space to the issue of whether derivatives markets destabilize prices in the underlying spot market, or do they stabilize prices in the underlying spot market? So if you have futures trading in urad dal, does it lead to price inflation in urad dal, or does it actually stabilize prices and reduce the amplitude of fluctuations? So these are the kinds of questions that we discuss at considerable length here. Now I would humbly assert that, and subject to correction, that this book probably contains the most comprehensive analysis of this particular question, that is stabilization and destabilization of the underlying market by derivatives, that we have come across anywhere. So that's a very ambitious assertion, but I'm still making it. And therefore, I think this is of great salience to policymakers and regulators. The book devotes a lot of attention to the role of speculators in the economy, and there is one particular quotation which I would like to talk about here. Just give me a minute while I find it. I'll read two quotations. They're from two very different people, two different points of time and two different societies. One, an American Republican, and the other from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But I'll read the quotations. For my part, I wish every one of them, speculators, had his devilish head shot off. It's quotation number one. Quotation number two, for as long as we fail to treat speculators the way they deserve, with a bullet in the head, we will not get anywhere at all. The first quotation is from Abraham Lincoln, and the second quotation is from Vladimir Lenin. And we have such a strong consensus between them on what speculators, how speculators should be dealt with, something that is fairly similar. We have a fairly similar consensus between the CPIM and the RSS also on this question. So it's a question that we go into in considerable detail in this book. Are speculators good or bad? Do they perform a useful role, or are they vermin to be exterminated with a bullet in the heads? The book has a fairly detailed coverage of the causes of the rapid growth of derivatives markets in the last 25 years. The role of derivatives, of course, we have a full chapter on derivatives and the global financial crisis. The effects of modeling on market behavior, because as we show here, models are sometimes performative in the sense that the way you use the model actually changes the market that it is modeling. We look at derivatives in emerging markets and their role in development, and we look at regulatory policy in quite some depth. Financial experts believe that a good investment portfolio is one which is well diversified and where the individual elements in the portfolio are not correlated with each other. We've tried to get you a well diversified panel of two experts. One, Dr. Bibek Debroy, makes policy. The other, Mr. Saurabh Mukherjea, makes money. Or he helps others make money, and hopefully both. Now, financial experts will also tell you that different securities in a portfolio may have unexpected correlations, and this can sometimes be something that you're not aware of. There is one correlation between the two panelists which they share with, I think, I may not be wrong here, which I think they share with a majority of Indian intellectuals, which is that they both speak Bengali. Now, Dr. Debroy, I will not attempt to introduce him, but nevertheless, as a formality, I have to do it. He's chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, was associated with the Niti Aayog in its formative years, is a polymath. His interests range somewhere between the Mahabharata and the history of the Indian Railways. He's somebody that you read about almost every day in the papers, very influential thinker, somebody that we are very proud has consented to be at this function at 3 p.m. on a working day, and he started late. So we are very conscious of this. Nevertheless, sir, thank you very much for being here. Our other distinguished panelist brings the other perspective. He's Mr. Saurabh Mukherjea, very well known in the markets as till very recently the CEO of Ambit Capital, one of the very prominent investment banks in Bombay, one which punches above its weight in terms of its presence on the TV channels, CNBC, and the economic channels. Considered a very influential thinker, author of a number of books, which you probably have read them. They're more interesting than these books, I can tell you. He's now the founder of Marcellus Investment Managers. He started off on his own, and he will perhaps become bigger than Ambit Capital not very far from now. So again, he's come all the way from Bombay, Mumbai, let me be precise here. He's come all the way from Mumbai to be at this event, and we're very grateful to him. I will not introduce my two very distinguished co-authors, Dr. V. Anantha Nageswaran, investment banker with Swiss banks, columnist in many newspapers, frequent talking head on financial channels, and soon to be director of the management school at Kriya University, which is this new university just outside Chennai but inside Andhra Pradesh. And Harsh Gupta, who is an investment manager himself, and is just, he heads Ashika Capital, investment manager, and a co-author on derivatives. With this, I now hand it over to Dr. Debroy to make some remarks, following which we will go to Saurabh Mukherjea, and then we, the authors, will respond to their comments, and after which we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Most people know him as TV, so I shall continue to refer to him as TV. Let me thank TV and Anant and Harsh for having invited me to come here to talk on something that I know very little about. Whatever I know about it is based on another book, which is the one right at the bottom, which TV mentioned, which was the first book which had the single author. So in some way, these two books are also derivatives. And when I got them, I was mystified, and I continue to be a bit mystified about why there are two different books. And yes, TV gave you an explanation. Sounds convincing. I don't find it terribly convincing. And I'm also somewhat mystified about who wrote what. Because one of these, this one, has three authors. And the That one has two authors. But the styles are completely different. So it's as if a different person wrote this book. Which is what I think has actually happened. Because I suspect, I'm not expecting an answer from the co-authors, I suspect what has happened is this book has essentially been written or rewritten by Hirsch. Its style, apart from what TV said, its style is much more that of a textbook. And the style of this is much more that of researchers. And styles do tend to differ. There is very little for me to add to what is already in the book, and I presume the intention behind any panel discussion is to trigger a purchase decision by people who are attending, rather than to try and distill out whatever is in these two very, very useful books on which the authors are best positioned to express their views. Let me just add 2 or 3 things to what TV has already said. The first one, and remember I said this is much more textbookish in nature. This has a very, very useful definition of a derivative. Because after all, we need to know what is it that is a derivative. And the term is used very loosely by all kinds of people. So what exactly is a derivative? And there is a very useful definition which I will not steal either Anantha or Harsh's thunder, but I will suggest that one of you mention this definition of a derivative, which is right towards the beginning and is very, very useful. I think the second thing that is very useful in this book is about what explains the explosion in the use of derivatives. Thirdly, and this is more in this book, should we try to regulate derivatives at all? As this book argues, economists are often against regulation. Economists of a certain training are against regulation. So is there any reason to regulate derivatives? And of course, there are very, very good reasons to regulate derivatives. And the answers as to why you should regulate derivatives are in this book. But the most interesting question of all, which I hoped there would be an answer, and to which there is no answer, and perhaps there isn't an answer, is assuming you want to regulate derivatives, what should be the content of that regulation? Or what should be the content of that regulation going beyond motherhood statements? They can be motherhood statements, but going beyond motherhood statements, the policy derivative, so to speak, of these 2 books has to be what should be the content of that regulation. This doesn't have much on that, understandably, because of its focus, but neither does this one. So these 2 books, more this rather than this from the point of view of the policymakers, TV himself said, this gives you a lot of information. It tells you about what you should do and what you should not do. But I think there is scope for a 3rd book, provided you can find a 4th author. But next time round, please don't confuse us with 2 books. Try and consolidate the 2, and if there is a textbook to be written, now that Anantha is going to join Kriya, perhaps it should be rooted via Kriya for the vast majority of us. Just have one book that focuses on what should be done to regulate, if at all regulation is desired. But I recommend both books read together Because there is some overlap, but as I said, the styles are completely different. I enjoy reading both of them. This was more of education, this was more of learning. If you detect the difference in the use of the two words. Thank you once again for having given me the opportunity to read the two books.
Thank you very much. And now I request Mr. Mukherjea to.
So it's a rare privilege to be here. In Mumbai, we mostly get invited to sort of film premieres, and obviously nobody asked us to speak. They don't even come there to see us. So it's a rare privilege to be invited to speak at an event where I actually get to talk. So thanks, thanks Anantha, thanks Harsha, thanks Dini. As Stevie Somanathan has already said, I'm a sort of a Bengali sort of rebelled against my genes and has decided to make money as much of it as possible. And what happened therefore was that when I was sent both the books, it took me around 5 minutes to figure out that if I read this, I'll make a lot of money, right? And therefore I read it because as my firm's intent is, my job is to help other people make money. And the reason I read it, I think has relevance for not just us people in this room, but also people outside. And I put it as a thought experiment. I reckon if this such an event was held 3, 4, 5 years out, this room will be full. I guarantee it will be full. Because I think in the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, the material in this book will touch upon the lives of the vast majority of you, your relatives, your friends, because of, I think, 3 changes taking place in our country. And in a way, my hope is that the authors, in a way, sort of bring their books, perhaps future books, in sync with the 3 changes taking place in our country. I think change number 1 is that for the people sitting in this room and our relatives and friends outside, the use of real estate or jewellery as a means to retire is basically gone now, right? So if you are my age, you're older than me, you have 30, 40 years ahead of you, and you have no hope in hell that real estate or gold will take you through a happy retirement, right? And even if you seek a modest middle class retirement in India, let's say 20, 30 lakhs per annum, you need to retire on a corpus of at least 10 crores in today's money. Like if you retire 10 years out, compound that with inflation. Now, I don't know about you, but less than 1% of my relatives have any hope of retiring with at least 10 crores in the bank, right? And that issue, I think, is facing millions of Indian middle class people today, right? Till 3-4 years ago, Indians had a hope, perhaps not grounded in reality, but Indians had a hope that their flats, their land, some ancestral property would give them a cushion for retirement. That is now gone. There's no hope in hell real estate will give you any cushion for anything. And as a result, for everybody that you and I know, they need to think for themselves for the rest, how do they finance the rest of their lives. If you retire at 60, average expectancy for people in our socio-economic strata is around 85. But 25 years, you're going to finance your life with your wits, right? Because nobody else is going to do it for you. And in that context, saving through the financial system will become an essential element of everybody's lives. It won't just be something that an esoteric group of people sitting in Bombay and people like me do. It's something everybody will have to do if they want to put food on their plate in their retirement years. Right? So finance will come home to Indian middle class people because of existential issues and because of the demise of real estate and gold. RBI data still says that 95% of Indian wealth, a remarkable RBI report from a year ago, says 95% of Indian wealth is in the form of physical assets. And that should sort of send a shudder down the spine of anybody who's either got physical assets himself, herself, or their relatives have it. Because physical assets, as we know, don't even compound at the rate of inflation. Right? So you've got a dying asset in your portfolio. So first reason is real estate's demise and the rise of financial markets, the rise of financial assets. The second is, in a way, the generation that started work in the mid-80s, mid-90s, people who were sort of 10, 15 years away from retirement. This generation has had a good life. Standards of living have risen sharply in the last 30 years, and they want to retire and continue living a good life. That's not going to be possible without the use of the sorts of instruments talked about in this book. The third reason the material in this book will come home to everybody's lives is our stock market, right? The bulk of the money in our stock market, research has repeatedly now shown, of the $140 billion invested in mutual funds, 100 billion doesn't even compound at the rate of the index. Basically, we've got large cap fund managers, 80% of whom don't keep up with the market. Right? They charge fees, but they don't even give the return of the index. Right? So it's called it's called the death of alpha. There is no alpha, and sort of a pretentious finance term, but it basically means fund managers take money, but they can't even keep up with the market. Right? And the reason for that, in a way, is the penultimate chapter of this book. So what's happened is, over the last 20-25 years, the stock market has got more and more money. And the core of the Nifty or the BSE 100, the ability for fund managers to beat the market has been eliminated because they're trading with each other. Institutional fund managers are trading with each other. And they're trading in a sort of zero-sum game where they're unable to beat the market. But they yet charge 2% fees that SEBI reduced per force last week. And I sit on the SEBI committee, which reduced the fees last week through a regulatory change. Fund managers have been forced to cut their fees. Now, because fund managers have been forced to cut their fees and fund managers don't keep up with the market, what's happening is discerning investors are moving away from mutual funds into alternative asset management. Right? So, if I link with my previous point, people like you and me will have to save to the financial system. The professional intermediaries we had hired to do that, mutual fund managers, have sort of broadly given up the game. They can't beat the market. So people like you and me are now going to alternative fund managers or alternative investment managers. In a way, people of money, perhaps Harsha's it, and they're saying, help us, we need to beat the market. The mutual fund CEO, CIO can't do it, can you do it for us? And to pull that off, derivatives are essential. And here's why. If any of you have a stock market portfolio, there's a high chance 40, perhaps 50% of your portfolio will be Indian banks. Right? And everybody who invests in banks thinks that they have a view on the bank CEO, the bank's accounts, the quality of management, and so on. But if you look at Indian banks' share prices, 65% of the volatility in Indian banks' share prices are driven by interest rates, the exchange rate, and by GDP growth. What I'm getting at is, when you invest in an Indian bank, basically you buy a derivative on the Indian economy. Right? No fund manager will tell you that, because the fund manager will say, I went and met Puri or I met Ramesh Sokti, and this is Mr. Puri's strategy for running the bank, this is Mr. Sokti's, and I've taken a considered view as the fund manager on which bank to put money in. What no fund manager will say is irrelevant which bank you choose, because inherently Indian banks are primarily a play on interest rates, exchange rates, and the GDP growth. Right? Similarly, if you buy an Indian metals and mining stock, 51%, more than the majority of the volatility in Indian metals and mining stock will be the underlying volatility in the commodity price. So you think you're buying, say, Hindalco or Tata Steel, actually you're buying effectively the commodity on the London Metal Exchange. Right? Now, what derivatives allow you to do, and this book I think brings it out very nicely, is it allows you to strip out the effect of, say, the interest rate or the exchange rate on the bank stock price, and allows you to isolate the skill of the management team in running the bank. So at the moment, our country doesn't use these strategies because there was no deep need for it. Retail investors would go to the mutual fund CIO and give him their money, hoping, praying that the guy gives a fair return. As the data abundantly shows that is not happening, and hence the need for using cleverer strategies to beat the market. Just get off the wall. So, SEBI created 4 years ago a regime called the Alternative Investment Fund regime. So in that regime, fund managers are authorized to now buy stocks and buy derivatives in the same portfolio. So smart fund managers sitting in Bombay are doing in a way what the penultimate chapter of the book says. They're buying these shares in the bank, but they're also buying derivative instruments, interest rate futures or exchange rate futures, which strip out the effect of the macro volatility on the stock, right? And similarly with metals and mining companies. So historically in our country, we think we have a large futures and options market, but primarily in India, equity F&O is in the Nifty. Stock-specific futures are not particularly widely traded in our country, and commodity futures were traded by a very different group of people. Nobody in the equity market traded commodity futures. So what you're now going to get is a situation where the same fund manager who buys the stock will also buy interest rate futures, perhaps buy commodity futures, and the SEBI AIF regime allows you to do that. Right? So you and I will end up giving our money to some of these fund managers to help us save for retirement. The fund managers will not follow the tried and tested norm of going and buying a few large Indian stocks and coming and charging you 2%. He will do something differentiated. And in a way, the penultimate chapter of the book, I think, is very prescient in that regard. But there's also another element of this book, which in a way has been playing out in front of us last week, perhaps will play out in front of us next week, which is interest rate volatility and what it does to our lenders. So I think all of you must have followed the drama around ILFS and a mutual fund in Bombay selling some bonds issued by a mortgage financier. So the mutual fund tried to sell those bonds too quickly, and as a result, the interest rate of the mortgage financier rose, and there was a panic in Bombay that now the entire mortgage finance industry will go into a tailspin. Now, a lot of these issues kick in because our own lending industry, the mortgage financiers, the non-bank finance companies, the banks, don't make adequate use of derivatives to hedge their own risk. So we're not talking here, no longer talking about investors, we're talking about a bank or a lender. A lender is naturally exposed to interest rate volatility. If interest rates go up, the lender borrows money at a higher rate. And our own lenders, as last week's event showed, our own lenders don't use interest rate futures to hedge out volatility. I think that will change, partly because again last week SEBI announced that every corporate has to have 25% of its borrowing from the bond market. And I'm glad SEBI made the announcement, because if they hadn't, there aren't that many banks in a way left for the corporates to borrow from anyway. So corporates will have to go to the bond market to borrow. As soon as companies are forced to go to the bond market to borrow, you start ending up needing interest rate futures. So I guarantee you 3 years hence, if you're sitting in this room again, you'll have a bigger audience for the book. But the reason in finance it helps to read the book early is if you're one step ahead of the curve in understanding what will happen next, courtesy learned authors like the finance in front of us, you make more money. My own publisher is not in the room, so I'll say something else. I invited my publisher, but they decided not to come. So my own publisher is not in the room, but I'll add a further point. This book is unusually well edited for a book on finance in India. So I don't know whether authors did it, whether Cambridge University Press did it. It's unusually well edited. That the editing is very, very sharp. There is not a superfluous word in the book. So if you see typical books on derivatives in the West, they'll be twice as thick as this, right? And sort of your wrist will pain after reading a 15 minutes, your muscles will be stronger for the exercise. They'll also have, and there's no derivative book anywhere in the world which discusses the turmeric market in family or how you hedge soybean risk, right? So the subject matter is Indian, the content is concise, and the editing, the sharpness of the language is actually quite breathtaking. So I will tell my own publisher to have a look at the book, just to appreciate how a difficult subject can be made practical, can be made relevant. And I am pretty confident that in our own country, in the current context of India, there are very few subjects which need more attention than this whole issue of how do you use derivatives and make sure that people have comfortable retirements, banks don't blow up, lenders don't blow up because they take on too much risk. And I'm sure, given the nudge from Mr. Debroy, they will be writing a book for regulators. It'll be widely appreciated in Bombay. I've sat on several regulatory committees where the regulator didn't have a clue about what derivatives is and how it works. Thank you for the opportunity.
Comments and then I'll...
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
I've just been informed that Dr. Debroy is a little unwell, so he's just stepped out, and so could we go ahead?
Yeah, I think although Dr. Debroy is not here to listen to my response to some of the interesting comments he made, it's fairly straightforward as to why the two books are still written by the same authors. it just shows that the authors are versatile enough to be able to cater to different audiences. That's a very simple explanation. So they could write a textbook which is meant for undergraduate students, and they could write a textbook which is meant for doctoral students and regulators and academics, as simple as that. And the second explanation, of course, is the timelines are very different. We completed the first one, the economics of derivatives, in 2014. 13-14, and it eventually saw the light of the day in 2015, early 2015, and this one came out late last year. 2018, in fact, yeah. So not late last year, but early this year. So the timelines were quite different. So we had the bandwidth to be able to tailor our message and for different audiences, as simple as that. I think the real reason why derivatives evoke both such controversy and some sort of mystique among public, among investors, among regulators is that they just don't spend the time required to understand what should I be looking out for when I engage with this instrument. Any investor in any market should ask the first question, what is the worst case that I would encounter if I buy this? What is the maximum possible loss that we can incur, or we will incur, in case my assumptions go wrong? And that is what the how of this book tries to point out. And the second book tells you, even though that is the ideal world, that every investor, whether he or she buys a stock or a bond or a derivative, should be asking the question, tell me in plain English, what is the maximum loss I will encounter? In fact, I believe a JP Morgan UK CEO once told his products committee, if you can't explain to me this product in barely 15 minutes in plain English, then I'm not going to give you the approval to sell this product to clients. It is there in Mervyn King's book, The End of Alchemy. He mentions this anecdote. So, but the truth is, neither the sellers are able to explain this in 15 minutes in plain English, nor the buyers of products ask the question, can you explain this to me in plain English? Since both of them don't do that, there is a role for regulators. And that is what the first book talks about. Given the ideal world doesn't exist, what should the regulators do to make sure that there is a sort of a level playing field between the sellers and the buyers of these products? While in an ideal world, textbooks will tell you that derivatives are meant for hedging. We know from history, American history, and that is what this book speaks about, the speculative role of derivatives is that 95% of the time it is used purely as a gambling instrument. Except that you don't go to a gambling house, but you go to a stock market to do this. And therefore, in that situation, how should regulators step in and ensure that consumers are protected, and more importantly, how the market stability is protected in the process? So those are all the key messages in this book. And as Saurabh put it, it is not as if they are bad instruments. There aren't bad instruments of financial markets. It is just a question of how well prepared we are. There is in fact only one aspect of derivatives where potentially the theoretical loss for an investor is unlimited. In all other cases, an investor can actually know what is the maximum amount he or she would lose. So both books have one common purpose, which is about educating. The one book simply tries to educate the investors and the users, and the second book tries to educate the scholars and the regulators of what these animal derivatives is all about. So that is my response to the comments made by our distinguished guests who came and spoke about the book at our request. Thanks to both of them, and thanks Saurabh. And as he correctly put it, hopefully in a few years' time, as Indians now more and more post-demonetization are getting into financial savings rather than real asset savings, it's all the more important that they know what they are really getting into and what they are using and for what purpose. I hope whether or not we write a third book, which is a consolidation of the first two books or a completely new one, it will still be written by us. not by a fourth author. And I hope the message is taken that we should, the only risk is in trading financial markets, the only risk is in not understanding what you are getting into. The risk doesn't lie anywhere else. The risk, as always, lies in ignorance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Somanathan. Thank you, Anant. I just want to first of all just clarify on the rumors that I wrote most of the second book. That's absolutely not correct. I was extremely honored to build on the first edition written by Dr. Somanathan. That actually gave us the framework for most of the book. The rest was just technical updating. I think what Saurabh said rightly, I think we are at the cusp of massive financialization of the Indian economy. To some extent we like it, to some extent we will not like it as it plays out. And derivatives, along with the use cases that he rightly pointed out, for example, if you're really buying Tata Steel, are you actually buying Tata Steel or are you buying the price of steel? In fact, a lot of people said that Mr. Mittal of ArcelorMittal made his wealth in the early 2000s when steel prices was down. You could have replicated that strategy by simply buying steel futures and call options. As it so happens on 1st October, so just a few days from now, commodity derivatives will finally be launched in India on NSE, on BSE. We'll have more unified system of trading equity, commodity derivatives across the same exchanges. So a lot of these silos will fall apart. We might also see very soon longer trading hours. So maybe not very good for market professionals who got used to the 3:30 close of the market, but nevertheless, there are also, besides portfolio management uses, there are also a lot of interesting, quirky public policy uses of derivatives, and I would not, without taking too much time, I would just elaborate on a couple of them, and that's about it. So for example, right now, India along with other countries has been in the process of building strategic crude reserves. As we all know, the crude prices have gone up from $26 in February 2016 to $82 right now. And crude reserves are meant to be released in times of emergency, mostly, but also sometimes when the prices are artificially high. So it's very easy, as first of all, as Dr. Debroy said, what is a derivative? Derivative is a security or a contract in the very first chapter, whose value moves based on the value of an underlying asset. So what you can do with crude, if you have, as the government of India, stored in some reserves in Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka and here and there, is you can continuously sell call options in the future. A call option is, for example, to airlines. Airlines would want to buy call options in crude because they want to make sure the prices don't rise too much. So for example, if there is a sudden spike to $100, the airline gets to call in, hence the name call in the crude at the price of $100 and not 120 if it goes to 120. And the government gets to release it at $100. But they got the premium, like an insurance premium for it, say $2, the month earlier when the price was $80. So the government can actually make a lot of money the whole year and anyways end up releasing crude, at least part of it, when they still wanted to release it. So that you can actually defray the costs of the entire SPR project, Strategic Petroleum Reserve Project. That other very simple example, much more retail, much more simple, is there are a lot of problems happening in agriculture. I just want to make clear that this is not a silver bullet. Derivatives will not solve all the various economic and financial problems we face, but it's an additional weapon in the toolkit, so to speak. So for example, farmers now maybe not just we have urad dal futures, we might have some urad dal call and put options. What do farmers basically want? Of course, there's a volume effect, there is weather and all that, but they have a massive fear of price falling. So they can just, for example, buy put options on wheat, on rice, on a lot of agricultural commodities, and that option is actually just not present so far. It should soon be available. And now, of course, with all this fintech and Paytm and smartphones, it's no longer very complicated to open an account and simply buy a few options as well. So it will not happen overnight and it will not solve all problems, but a big part of the risk could be taken off without the need of government insurance programs, though we'll also need that for volume and weather and other reasons. So there are many interesting use cases where the government can make some money for doing something it would have anyways done. Farmers can benefit, not to mention obviously portfolio managers and retail investors. And as Anant rightly said, as Dr. Somanathan has also mentioned, it really depends on how we end up using it. On regulation, there is obviously no easy answer, but I think a very quick and dirty answer would be maybe we have too much of it in India and too little of it in the US. So that's not a useful answer, but maybe we are a bit too cautious and maybe the West is currently too carefree about it. So with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. And I'll just add one or two sentences to what he said about farmers. One of the problems with our derivatives markets is they've so far been focused more on the financial sector and have actually underperformed in relation to what they could do for other sectors of the economy. So, for instance, it is conceivable that instead of a minimum support price for wheat and rice and pulses and various oilseeds, you could actually have a government-sponsored set of put options where the government pays the premium and the farmer gets a put option. And one could compare the costs of such existing PDS, FCI, storage, rats eating it, human rats eating it, all these other costs can be compared. And then you can actually perhaps run a put option scheme paid for by the government, but then you will need liquidity. So you will also need speculators to come in and play the role of the other side of the market. These are some of the potential uses of derivatives, which unfortunately we've not used much of. We've actually used them more as stock market instruments, financial market instruments, and not really looked at how to use them to protect people who need protection from price risk, many of whom are poor. So there are very poor people who need protection from price risk, and protection from price risk is actually the raison d'etre of most of the derivative markets. So with that, I will stop and I'll ask if there are any questions from the audience. We'll be very happy to answer.
If there is nobody else, thank you for having this event. Thank you, Anand, for alerting me and inviting me.
You all given very good presentations. And Saurabh, you raised some questions in my mind, which were unduly influenced by Anwar Sheikh from New York University, who was a fierce and very effective critic. I think this is a very important issue that needs to be understood. But I'm not politically economist, I'm not a technical economist, but my reaction to all of this, and reading about it, not just Financial Times, I was just reading talking to Anantha, the bankovity regulations, some of the BIS material, that asymmetric information, which is creation, to me, common sense is like gambling. If it's asymmetric, then this is gambling. Right? But that's a kind of market failure, and as you correctly pointed out, policy can breach this gap. On the other hand, I try hard to keep an open mind because I see some very negative distributional consequences after 2008, and asset prices inflated. And despite being a beneficiary, I'm very conscious that many others, lower end, particularly in the UK, have suffered grievously. It seems to be, it's a bit like fractional banking. When fractional banking first came in, this was a market creation which was very important for supply side transformation of the economy. So in a way, derivatives are kind of parallel to that, except they are feared now. Even you quote Jamie Dimon and also Warren Buffett, $6 trillion market which is going to eat us alive. You've already answered one question which I was going to ask, which, without reading the book but looking at the list of contents, was that what happens, derivative price volatility has an impact on the underlying asset performance. And that you already identified as an important question. It's a macro, large issue for which there is analysis required. The one thing that I've become aware of since 2008, and there's been a lot of writing on this, and derivatives are actually one aspect of this, that the nature of the rewards to the likes of you people influences selling and catching the products. And this is a public policy issue. This is a serious public policy issue. That it seems to me derivatives are here to stay. I think Saurabh, you have convinced me that there is
this is sharing insurance risk. It is here to stay. But how do you regulate the rewards? Because, for example, the guy who brought down AIG in London, he walked away with all his money. He didn't pay any debt. It's extraordinary. My banking friends are all laughing. My friends in the IMF are all laughing, you see. None of them really paid a heavy price. Some, of course, got the job, but many others didn't. So this issue of rewards and the question of how do you really measure the impact on asset performance of derivative price volatility. I've gone on a bit too long, so my apologies.
Thank you very much for those comments, and I'll begin by addressing a few of them, and then I'll ask Harsh to pick up. You pointed out that the issue of whether derivatives markets destabilize the underlying market or not. I won't go into depth, but I'm assuming that if you're interested in that question, I do hope you read the chapters here, because we have actually 3 chapters on it. One which covers the theory behind why they stabilize prices. The second, a whole chapter on why they may destabilize prices. And the third chapter is the synthesis of in which circumstances in real life do you consider them to be stabilizing, and in which would you consider them destabilizing. And as a regulator, you need to know which is which, because you shouldn't intervene if it's doing the right thing, and you should when it is not. So, but in essence, the classical theory, Milton Friedman, everybody, Hicks, all believe that speculation is stabilizing, because a speculator buys low and sells high. So he buys when prices are cheap and he sells when prices are high. So he's actually going against market forces. But we discussed at length that there are situations like momentum trading, when you buy and therefore you induce somebody else to buy, and then somebody else buys, and then somebody else buys, where actually it's destabilizing. And there are a few other nuances in terms of how it stabilizes, and we've discussed that at length here. And the truth is that whereas economists used to believe that actually the consensus 10 years ago, probably till September 7, 2008 was, the economists knew they were right and it was stabilizing, but these stupid politicians and all these RSS, CPIM type people didn't understand it. And they always believed it to be destabilizing, but the economists knew they were right. Now, what we refer to in this book is that the economists may not have been right, and in some situations they can be destabilizing. It's a fact. There's empirical evidence, there's theoretical basis for it, and therefore regulators need to be aware of it. So that's a very quick response to that. You also mentioned the issue of rewards. Disproportionate rewards for the taking of risk at someone else's expense, which is really the worst thing that happened to most managers who mismanaged other people's money was they got fired with their severance bonuses, which were usually bigger than the 10 years salaries of the investors that they had taken money from.
Not more than your 10 crores.
So we do discuss that here, and we even argue that there is a case for very old-fashioned. We can disagree, but controls on remuneration of people who are in these, and particularly the avoidance of performance-linked bonuses, because a performance-linked bonus is irreversible. You get the bonus when it rises, and you don't give it up when it falls. So when it falls, you get fired, you take your bonus and go. But when it rises, you get a bonus. So we discuss some of these issues of remuneration, and those are discussed here. Now, Anant or Harsh, whichever wants to go first.
I think the question of whether the compensation and the broader instability that derivatives create is also a function of the broader force of which derivatives is only one manifestation, which is the financialization. I think this, the Economics of Derivatives book does talk about the financialization aspect, which was manifest in the volume of derivative trading that exploded post 1999, when the United States actually took them out of the ambit of CFTC regulations. Some of these over-the-counter derivatives, which became unregulated. So I think the broader issue which the crisis threw up is not just the role of derivatives, but the bigger social phenomena of finance driving the real economy and the society, and that is discussed as well. And 10 years later, we probably are still in the same place internationally. And I think, in fact, Dr. Y.D. Reddy was praised around the time of the 2008 crisis, for some of the measures that he took, especially regarding this performance and people who benefited from this, because he brought about some very simple changes in the way in which investment bankers were remunerated. You don't get the money as soon as you put the structure together and you walk away with it. You get the money only after the structure is eventually unwound. So this very simple tweak of the rule ensured that the investment bankers didn't get the benefit as soon as they sold the product and it left their hands, but after it was completed, the cycle was completed. So there was only one instance of that. In fact, his entire speech in 2008, before 3 or 4 months before the crisis in Manchester, gives a wonderful compilation of all the measures that the RBI took, which later on have become de rigueur in the Western world. The macro-prudential measures, etc., which became the norm in the West, were there in India before 2008. But be that as it may, and since there was a talk of another book, and it's a pure coincidence that I somehow seem to have a fascination for co-authoring books with those who are in the Prime Minister's office. One is Dr. Somanathan, and the other book I am co-author, which again I'm very pleased to mention that Cambridge is the publisher, is with another officer called Gulzar Natarajan, and it's coming out hopefully in the next few months. And it's called The Rise of Finance, Causes, Consequences and Cure. Obviously, the last word tells you that how we feel about the rise of finance. We want a cure for it. So, and one of the manifestations of financialization, one of the manifestations of the disease was derivatives, and that is what we have tackled in these 2 books. And hopefully, that one will tackle the broader issues that gave rise to derivatives as a phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. So just a very quick response there. I think what happened was the whole instrument, the set of financial derivatives is very new. It started basically in the 1970s. And till the 90s, early 2000s, there was definitely a sense of Wild West about how to go about it. For example, Warren Buffett himself spoke about weapons of mass destruction, financial derivatives, but he sold long-term puts on various equity indices for billions of dollars as premium. But what has happened after the crisis is there is a realization that a lot of these OTC or over-the-counter derivatives should be routed through exchanges, and therefore margins should be paid and so on and so forth. In the US, the Dodd-Frank regulation happened, which did not fully go through, has been partially repealed and so on and so forth. But even a Warren Buffett now with his great credit and reputation cannot sell billions of dollars of long-term put options and not pay any margins for it. And once you pay margins for it, the whole value proposition of that particular trade goes away. So there has been somewhat of a clampdown compared to earlier, and one short answer is to do it more standardized, don't have very bespoke derivatives, don't go through OTC desks, go through exchanges where you have margins. And I think at least in India we have been going in that direction. So there is always a bit of a cost, because if you do it too much, then the Indian rupee gets traded in Singapore and Dubai through all these kind of exotic products. So it's a matter of balancing that, and we are very much in the early stages there.
Anyone else?
Do you see a future wherein the retail investors, quantitative retail investors, will also be getting into derivatives, or do you think it will be more at an institutional level? Secondly, we all know the Lehman crisis and everything, and there was a factor in the increasing use of derivatives and speculation. So, how do you think the regulators will play a role to avoid, any such Lehman kind of movement in India?
The market, actually, the retail market. One theory is that there is a new set of suckers who graduate from business schools every year, who come in and form next year's participants in the retail market. They play for 3 or 4 years, get burnt out, they leave, the next cohort comes in, and it keeps happening. So that's not the way it should be, but that is actually, I mean, Harsh may disagree, but I actually think that's to a large extent what happens, that people do it until they've burnt their fingers and then get out. And then they go back into fixed deposits or small savings schemes, and then gradually come back to equity and so on. So that's second. Your second question was on derivatives and the Lehman crisis. Yeah. Again, to encourage you to read, there's a whole chapter on derivatives and the Lehman crisis in the book. That was a very complicated derivative instrument, which was the root cause of this, collateralized debt obligations. again, they had further segmented them into tranches where you have a debt, and let's say you're a bank, you have debts owed by different people. So you have a AAA rated borrower like Partho who's paying me on time every month. Then I have a CCC rated person like Anantha who will, well, not CCC, BBB rated person who usually pays me but sometimes doesn't. And I can actually parcel this out and issue a AAA rated security which is backed by his asset and a BBB rated one which is backed by him. And I can actually get rid of both loans from my books. So as a bank, I have now lost interest in the collection of both of these loans because I've sold my risks to someone else. Now at some point, I begin to find it very easy. I just keep making loans and then I parcel these loans into nice derivative securities, send one to someone else. And for the buyer, it's very easy. I have a nice credit rating from one of those wonderful credit rating agencies who never go wrong except twice a year. And you then buy the security and you think, and it's rated, so you can actually get collateral, you can, the regulator doesn't object. But then what happened is some of them stopped paying and it just unraveled the whole structure. And so, yes, derivatives had a lot to do with the Lehman crisis. But as Harsh had said, these were not exchange-traded derivatives. So nobody actually knew how many CDOs had been issued by which person to which person, because they were all one-to-one transactions off the markets. If it were exchange-traded, the risks would not have changed, but awareness would have changed. People would have known that, there is so much outstanding of CDOs on a given day, and that if all of them go bust, this is the consequence for the market. So players would have been, and by the way, use of the term player and bet is very common in these markets. There's a reason why it's very common. Because the term bet is very commonly used. It's used because it's appropriate. So you actually need to be aware of this, but if anyone wants something.
Actually, I would rather have Saurabh answer the question of whether a Lehman situation could arise in India because a couple of weeks ago, I think September 8th or so, he wrote a piece for his clients. And even before that, we both had met in August at an investor conference in Coimbatore. And he was talking about the risk of non-banking financial corporations in India getting into stressful situation. And therefore, I think he is the apt person to answer that question about the Lehman moment in the Indian context. Thanks for that. So,
it's actually very interesting that you're right, derivatives were clearly part of the tragedy that took place in America 10 years ago. But my reckoning is in our country, the lack of derivatives on the part of the lack of use of derivatives on the part of Indian lenders could actually be a key part of the challenge of the next 6-7 months. Because interest rate futures, I think RBI tries to get interest rate futures markets going. I think the latest attempt was 2015. But it hasn't really taken off. It's better off than we were 4-5 years ago. But I don't know of any large lender in India who hedges his interest rate risk by using derivatives. They should do it, but they don't. The reason they don't do it is I suspect a lot of these lenders are not willing to admit just how fragile their existence is in terms of if the interest rate cycle were to zap up, whether it's because of something America does, something RBI does, something, say, a bond fund manager in Bombay does, while the interest rate cycle zaps up, let's leave that by the by. If the interest rate cycle shoots up, the vast majority of our banks, private sector banks, and almost all our NBFCs and HFCs, I think face a challenge. Now, my reckoning is it's a mental block. So by and large, our country, we aren't really still a society which has come to terms with the free market, right? So especially in the case of lending, we're still a society which believes lending is primarily done by banks. Increasingly, that's no longer the case, right? Whether we like it or not, the bond market, the wholesale bond market is increasingly influential. But the people who run our lenders are still old-style bankers who believe interest rate risk is something they can manage and control, right? Ironically, the running institutions where the interest rate risk, I reckon, is out of control. So the specific issue, I think, the regulator will, I think, belatedly look at is, do our lenders offset the interest rate risk inherent in their books? The Indian equivalents of the Lehman blowups, right? So our housing finance companies, our NBFCs who borrow money in the wholesale market, short-term money in the wholesale market, give it to folks like us to buy houses. So they borrow 3-month money and they make 20-year loans, right? Imagine the risk embedded in that. But they're not willing to defray that risk of borrowing 3 months and lending 20-year. They're not willing to defray that using the interest rate futures market, partly because the market simply isn't that liquid, but the market isn't that liquid because participants don't realize the need to use it. So in our country, the lack of use of derivatives by lenders, I think, will potentially play a very central part in the events that will fructify in the next 6-7 months, where for the first time, we'll go into an interest rate upcycle with the core of our banking system in the sort of intensive care unit. And hence the core of our economy going into this interest rate upcycle, the crux of the Indian economy for the first time will be funded by the wholesale market. And I think both for this banking sector, for the lending sector, and for the real economy, it will be a very interesting test. Can we deal with an interest rate upcycle with a wholesale funded economy where the wholesale funded lenders haven't defrayed that risk? And I think, embedded in my question, you can probably see the germ of an answer.
Yes, anyone else?
So I've read the derivatives second edition book. I haven't read the economics of derivatives. So my question is, could you comment on how would the role of speculators change if or when physical delivery is made compulsory in India?
Physical delivery makes speculation more difficult, especially in commodities. Because if you actually physically deliver a commodity, you actually have to have it. So if I'm speculating in a tur dal market, I have to somewhere get 100 tons of tur dal and a lorry and a warehouse. So yeah, if you insist on physical delivery, it is a disincentive to speculation. Now, whether that's good or bad depends on whether you want to discourage speculation for some reason, or if things are fine, I think that's an overkill. But to answer very specifically, insistence on physical delivery makes it more difficult to speculate for someone who has no intrinsic interest in the security or the commodity. But is that good or bad will depend on the situation. Did I answer it? I mean,
you did. But what about derivatives on stocks in financial derivatives?
Not as difficult because I can always buy it in the stock market and then deliver. So I can do a financial transaction with this. So I'm not sure it's as effective. It increases transaction costs because instead of simply offsetting, I have to actually do a parallel cash market transaction and then deliver. So it may not be as effective with stocks, but it still adds a slight cost to the speculation in terms of transaction costs. So it is still more difficult with delivery than without delivery. Him and then Mr. Nageswaran Singh. First, this gentleman here.
Just a comment, Anantha, big fan. I've been reading your column Bear Talk for the last 7 years. And I know it's an illustrious panel, but honestly, you are the reason I'm here. No, I know you've already mentioned it, and I look forward to reading that book. But if you could slightly talk about one of the running threads in your columns of the last 7 years being your, if I could use the word dislike with the increasing financialization of Indian economy, that you're not very impressed with the way financialization is worked out in the US. So if you could throw some light, and if this is the right forum, otherwise we can chat offline, on the book that you're writing, and what do you think is the way forward if we have to make the downsides of financialization limited to the economy? And to sort of just one question, over the last 2 years, thanks to this glut of liquidity, we've seen valuations going way ahead of the earnings. That's been the talk on the street actually, and that's how we felt by advising. Do you think now that this retail equity flow is going to be there for the foreseeable future, that divergence is going to increase? And if not, then what will be the figure? Thank you. I think in the interest of time, I would let Saurabh answer the second question, and we can have the conversation offline.
Absolutely. I was hoping that Anand says that financialization is what's driving the Indian stock market. I think there's a short-term answer and there's a longer-term concern. The short-term answer is the financialization of the economy, especially after demonetization. Clearly in 2017, you saw it push the stock market up to push the stock market up and push bond yields to levels we've never seen. In 3 months, commercial paper rate fell to 6.1% in July 2017, and there's no rational reason for that other than the fact that demonetization pulled money out of people's mattresses and slammed it into the financial system. And the logical unwind of that is what we are going through, right? Because in the last 14 months, as we have normalized the cost of capital, the 10-year bond yield is up 170, 180 bits, and the wholesale lenders' costs are up YOY 210, 220 bits. And I reckon it will be very difficult for them to deal with that sort of jump in cost. As the wholesale lenders roll over their borrowings in the next 3, 4, 5 months at 220 bips, 230 bips above what they paid last year, I think that in a way will jam the system, and hence my consistent concern for what happens to the core of the stock market. 40% of our stock market is now lenders. But the longer term concern I have is, as we were discussing, it's not apparent people's monies have anywhere else to go. Real estate is not really a viable place to save up for retirement. Certainly no country in the world has sort of helped people retire by buying flats and land and so on. So clearly we have to help people save for retirement through the financial system. But our stock market itself can't take $200-300 billion of domestic savings. So how exactly do we channel savers as savings into productive use? Right? That is not apparent to me. And distinguished thinkers here in this panel who've sort of seen other countries do it, I think I'm sure will have inputs. But I reckon, my submission to the authorities, to the extent they're willing to listen, is I think we have to generally actively think about letting Indians save a bigger portion of their savings, put a bigger portion of their savings abroad. Otherwise, all that we'll do is we'll take people's monies, which are running away from an overvalued real estate market, and we'll put them in an overvalued stock market. But there will be a strain of thought in public policy will say, we're a poor country, we can't let Indians' money go abroad. And to that strain of thought, my response is, well, if you don't want Indians' money to go abroad, help them find productive means to save in India where they can get a return above the rate of inflation, which is hard to do outside the stock market. So the longer term concerns, I think, are significant on this issue. Short term, I think the market will do its own job of pulling the stock market back and injecting some sanity into the debate.
Thank you. Thank you. Somanathan, thank you. I have two questions to ask. One is partly for you and one is partly for Saurabh. In a market where there is acute information asymmetry, one of the phenomena associated with that is very thin trading. And in derivatives, in many of the markets of India, you get huge market imperfections. And that, of course, means that some of the nasty results, that is, maybe speculation, maybe producing a suboptimal or an inoptimal result, tends to increase. So the question is really, how do you increase information availability so information asymmetries come down? Otherwise, you're left with the situation we typically have in hedging a foreign exchange. No matter which way you hedge, you will end up at a loss on the hedging operations over a period of time, because the cost of the options is so high. And that is one thing. And so, result of that is many of the ideas are throwing out, okay, put an put option for agricultural prices. There isn't a counterparty for it. I mean, government would either make GIC a counterparty, in which case GIC would be asked to take a hit, and the Supreme Court would then lecture GIC, it's not your job to make a profit anyway. Or you would find an IFS-like counterparty would make a pile of money. So there are no counterparties with many of these kind of policy initiatives. But I think the bigger question is on market imperfection, really for Saurabh, because as you are hinting at, our banking system and our non-banking financial companies have a huge problem with misallocation of capital. So derivatives does not help really solve the problem. Are you allocating of capital growth which is scarce or maybe not scarce, efficiently or not? So interest-based risk hedging does not by itself improve the overall allocation or misallocation of capital. So your views on that?
So I'll go first. So on your first question, I think you're absolutely right. So what I said in terms of put options for MSP is completely infeasible if you don't have the liquidity where you have other people that will form counterparties to the government, absolutely. And that's where this question of how do we regulate and how do we deal with speculation in commodity markets becomes very important, because every time the price of chana dal rises, if you ban futures trading, then you will never have a liquid futures market, and you will then never have a liquid options market, which you could have used to protect people from price risk in chana dal. So it's a difficult question. I think it's a question where partly we have overreacted with regulatory overkill in many situations where the price rise had nothing to do with derivatives. The price rise had everything to do with supply shortages, and the price would have gone up anyway with or without a derivatives market. But the derivatives markets are prime candidates for political activity in terms of, there's no apparent value add. I mean, you can always accuse them of being a casino and then ban them. But a lot of empirical evidence indicates that in those situations, when the trigger is not derivatives led, when it's not momentum trading, when it's not information asymmetry, the trigger is there's a supply shortage of chana dal, then banning derivatives can make it worse than actually allowing them to trade. So I don't have an answer to your question. I think we need to first get to a situation where the commodity markets in India have adequate speculative volume, but speculative volume that is well regulated so that it doesn't become excessive to the level where it's driving the spot price. So that's a nice balance, ideal, may not be very easy to get to, but if we get there, then we have the potential to do other things with those markets.
So I'll partly agree with you, sir, that derivatives by itself cannot solve imperfect capital allocation issues, and I'll partly disagree, if I may. So let me begin by disagree and say that whether an NBFC gives a 20-year home loan or a 3-year loan to buy a smartphone, in a way is the NBFC's prerogative. What they lend for, whether they lend for a house or a motorbike, is in a way none of our business, so to speak. And all we are asking as market participants to those NBFCs is, can you at least make sure that you don't blow up because you've taken so much interest rate risk, whether it's 3-year risk or 20-year risk, right? And I reckon it will take one blow up, 1 year of blow ups, one sequence of blow ups for the NBFCs to learn the lesson that I shouldn't just stretch my duration out. I shouldn't just give longer and longer dated loans of higher and higher quantities without defraying the risk, because if I do that, I face a existential risk and I get wiped out. So it will probably take one nasty accident for the system to learn the lesson there. Where I partly agree with you is, what's become pretty apparent is whether it's the Indian bond market, whether it's Indian banks, or whether it's Indian NBFCs, we don't seem to find any way of lending in the Indian economy which lends fundamentally to manufacturing or infrastructure, any form of long-dated investment activity, right? We found many different avenues to lend to retail lenders, homes, cars, phones, etc. But we're not able to figure out whether it's through the bond market, through NBFCs, through infrastructure finance companies. We've tried almost every creature under the sun, right? We've never found a way to nail this problem, and therefore that inability of our financial system to find a way to intermediate capital to productive use, to capex, to investment use, is obviously a big challenge and a worrisome failure, and clearly the free market hasn't delivered the answers to that, whether it's pre-91 or post-91, and something that we need to figure out, because if we don't, we'll buy all of these things from our neighbors for a long time to come.
Okay, we're out of time, so thank all of you for giving us.
Thanks a lot to the audience, particularly because, as Professor Somanathan said, that on a weekday I can imagine how difficult it must be for everyone. So thank you for prioritizing this. Thank you to the panelists, our authors. I am very hopeful and I am waiting for the fourth book. Okay. And for Mr. Mukherjea, there is a comment for you. Rather than providing feedback to your publisher, why don't you consider changing your publisher? Please join us.